When you have an explanation for why the narcissist is doing what they're doing, you're more likely to make a rationalization or justification for their behavior. Oh, they're yelling because their fragile ego was revealed to the world and they were shamed. So they just had to lash out to protect themselves. It's okay. Let's just put up with it. No. So red flags, right? This is the conversation. What are the 5 red flags? Tell me the red flags. Maybe that's the tricky bit, is we keep looking for red flags, and maybe that's not the way to do it. Maybe it's time to stop looking for red flags. So what are you supposed to do instead? So instead of looking for red flags, what can you do? How about you pay attention to how you feel? Now, I know we've taken on this topic in many different ways on this channel, but I can't put too fine a point on it. And I think it gives you a connection to yourself that can really be a very useful tool for you for discernment. Listen, I see the TikToks and the Instagram posts and the other videos and the news articles. 5 top red flags, 10 flags you need to know, 6 flags to identify you're in a relationship with a narcissist. This list, that list. Listen, for most of us, if someone did these red flag things within the first few weeks of a relationship, many of us would run away. But red flags don't tend to work that way. They tend to be subtle. They tend to be a very light pink that slowly turns to red. They take a minute to unfold. They may be nonverbal, and they tend to be peppered in to what feels like a relationship that's nice in some ways. Red flags are specifically tend to refer to the beginning of a relationship or a turn in the road of a relationship. Exactly at a time when it's about love bombing and idealization and seduction and excitement and feeling good. So the red flags tend to get peppered in there with the good stuff, and they aren't the only prevailing state, which is why love bombing is so confusing, because there's maybe a few pinkish or reddish red flags popping up, and the good stuff pushes us to justify or rationalize, because especially in those early days, at a minimum, lots of people want the relationship to keep going. So what else can we do about staying on top of some of these earlier signs that a relationship may not be healthy? Why don't we try a little bit of somatic awareness? I don't even call this intuition, though you may experience it that way. But it's something that you might feel in your body. The proverbial hairs that stand up on the back of your neck. But it may not just be that. It may be a discomfort in your stomach, a tightness in your chest, a constriction of your throat, a discomfort that you just can't name and that you try to shake off. Just about any survivor of narcissistic abuse will think back to that time. Just do that for a minute right now. Think of one of the more impactful adult narcissistic relationships in your life. I mean, even a childhood one, if that's what works, but this tends to make a little bit more sense in adult relationships. Close your eyes. Think about as you started to feel more aware in this relationship that something wasn't right. How did you feel it physically? How did you talk to yourself about that feeling? Most of us don't give enough credence to these feelings. We may want to write them off to butterflies in our stomachs or fear or anxiety rather than, my body is telling me something isn't right here. I need to slow down. And of course, there might be all kinds of structural factors that are operating. You may feel pressured to make a relationship work, or you may like some things about this person, or you may feel an obligation to stick it out. So you may just push away these feelings or even pathologize them. Oh, I'm so paranoid. I need to stop this. But your body picks up that sense that someone's not really safe. Listen, those feelings, those bodily feelings, even came up for you in childhood if you had narcissistic parents, but it was a much higher stakes game then. That was a time when you didn't have the luxury of knowing what this bodily feeling meant. To view a parent as bringing up red flags, a kid doesn't know what red flags are. That's a whole tricky thing, right? For a child to feel there's something wrong with the parent feels disloyal. They may have a primal fear of losing the parent. They may fear punishment. But those detectors we carry in our body, they're even there for kids. I remember thinking, I'll tell you about a story about my childhood. I remember there's an adult in my neighborhood who made me very uncomfortable as a child. I physically felt that whenever I saw this person. And even when I'd walk home, I'd cross to the other side of the street when I went by that house. I didn't have a word for it. I just didn't feel safe. This person actually never harmed me. I also never went into situations where I saw the person was, even when other kids were going there. And when the situations would arise where this person would be, I would go home or ask to leave. And to my parents' credit, they never questioned why I would leave those situations. And they'd just say, okay, let's go home. I never shared the discomfort with anyone, but I felt it in my body. And that same bodily sensation, interestingly, is something that I felt when I encountered so-called red flags in adulthood as well. I wish I had been as clever as I'd been as a kid and done whatever the freaking equivalent was of stepping to the other side of the street then too. How do we feel these sort of early signs and signals in our bodies? We have to pay attention to the sensations in us. Sometimes they parallel the very same feelings we might feel in an empty parking lot at night when we hear something, or in some other place when we feel at risk. It doesn't mean you have to get up and leave, though it could, but it does mean you slow down. Perhaps cross to the other side of the street, as it were, and listen. Instead of trying to figure out if someone is looking at their phone too much on your third date, or talking about their ex-girlfriend too much, or interrupting you too much, instead of focusing on that, tune into yourself. It's not foolproof, and some of you may say, meh, I don't think I felt anything physically with my ex, but explore this a little. It may be a way of steering you away from this idea of sifting through these so-called red flags and instead tuning into yourself. So if you really try this, you might say, yeah, in some cases I did feel that physicality. Some of you might say, with a narcissistic ex, I didn't feel it in my body until things really started going south, but you did start feeling it then, and then still had to face the idea of what was hard for me to listen to in that. It might have been those practical factors that sort of sunk in. But I have to say that ahead of thinking about it, breaking it down, looking at checklists, if we really pay attention to that, this doesn't feel right. It comes up pretty quick. Sometimes it comes up right away. And it doesn't mean we get up and leave a conference room, but it could very well mean we distance ourselves, don't get into idle chit-chat, and end the conversation as soon as possible. What do I mean that when it comes to narcissism, that explanations are not excuses? As human beings, we always want to know why. Children ask that, why? Why, Mom? Why? 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 Getting the answer to why is comforting. If we know why someone's crying, we understand it. Maybe we can help them. If we know why someone ended a relationship, we may not like it, but we can get our heads around it. If we know why good people have bad things happen to them, it helps, give us a sense of faith and make sense of things. In fact, Viktor Frankl, the famous existential psychiatrist, writes that those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. Now that doesn't necessarily get at the reason for something, but why is such an important question. Why is what drives science and religion and, of course, psychology. I teach my undergraduates that one of the main goals of psychology is to explain human behavior. We're not always very good at it, especially when it comes to mental illness, but the why is why. Why is a person depressed? Why is a person anxious? Why is a person narcissistic? Now, this entire YouTube channel in many ways is devoted to the why of narcissism. Why do people who are narcissistic behave the way they do? Why do we respond the way we do? Why do we fall for their toxic behavior? Why do we stay in these relationships? Why are they so mean afterwards? But here's where it gets tricky. And in fact, for many people who get stuck in these relationships or keep playing out the cycles of idealization, devalue, discard, and hoovering, knowing the why of narcissism can end up becoming a bit messy because it can end up becoming an excuse. This has actually come up for me recently. I've been spending weeks writing a lecture on domestic violence and narcissism for a conference. There was some concern, and this has been a long-standing concern in the domestic violence world, is that if we frame relationship violence or gender-based violence from a narcissism lens, then there's a risk that we may in some ways almost excuse it or not view it as awful as it is because we're writing it off as due to mental illness. First of all, narcissism is not a diagnosis, nor is it a mental illness. Narcissistic personality disorder is, but in most people out there who you meet who are narcissistic, they don't have narcissistic personality disorder, and the word narcissistic is not a diagnostic term. But the bigger concern is that if we were to subsume domestic abuse or relationship violence under a pattern of narcissism, that we run the risk of excusing the behavior. Like we can address narcissism and that will change it, instead of saying this is just not okay. So let's use the domestic violence example for a minute. If someone is beating someone up or psychologically abusing a partner, and we frame it through a lens of narcissism and all that goes along with the fragile ego that is threatened by whatever it's threatened by, and so they lash out with aggression and rage to protect the ego, etc., we may be able to explain the personality style, narcissism, and the attendant violence that happens in the relationship through that lens. So then there's the risk of, oh, so that's why they're doing it. So maybe we can work on the narcissism with them and they will stop being violent. No, 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 no. Abuse is unacceptable. Violence is unacceptable. I don't care the reason they had for beating up a partner. I don't care if it was narcissism. I don't care if it was intoxication. I don't care if it was PTSD. I don't care if it's just that they ate some bad seafood. Don't care. It's unacceptable. And ideally, the relationship is done. If the abuser wants to go get help, they can go do it on their own time and on their own dime. So when it comes to narcissism, using that framework above and beyond domestic abuse and violence, explaining why narcissists do what they do can get tricky. Some people want to know why people become narcissistic, why narcissistic people lack empathy, why narcissistic people are mean to them, why they gaslight. And honestly, all of those things can pretty reasonably be explained. But then the issue becomes, what are you supposed to do with those explanations? An explanation is not an excuse. Just because you know that their difficult backstory, maybe of their own abuse, may be what contributed to this fragile core sense of self and their defensive, aggressive posturing, or their difficult father and difficult grandmother may have contributed to an intergenerational cycle, it doesn't excuse their behavior. Or perhaps they're very sensitive to criticism and that day they got laid off. That explains it. Why their shame got triggered, it doesn't excuse it. The challenge is that many people take the explanations for where narcissistic patterns come from and how they get triggered and turn them into an excuse for bad behavior. In essence, just further enabling and emboldening the narcissist who doesn't really care about the harm that they're causing other than the shame it may evoke from them, which then leads to more bad behavior. You simply can't win when you're dealing with narcissistic and other high conflict personalities. Cognitive dissonance also plays a role here. Basically, when you have an explanation for why the narcissist is doing what they're doing, you're more likely to make a rationalization or justification for their behavior. Oh, they're yelling because their fragile ego was revealed to the world and they were shamed. So they just had to lash out to protect themselves. It's okay. Let's just put up with it. No. There is a danger when you use the explanation as an excuse. And there's also a danger that once you start doing that, you start to gaslight yourself, like, maybe it's okay because they do have a fragile ego. Doesn't matter. It's not okay. The reason I want people to understand this explanation excuse issue is so they can set themselves free. And I also want people to understand narcissism so they can set themselves free. May not necessarily leave the relationship. I know that leaving parents or adult children is overwhelming. I know that leaving marriages is complicated because of custody issues.
But stop blaming yourself. No, there is not another way you could have said it to a narcissist so you could get a better response for them. There's not a better way to respond to a narcissist so they don't get mad. And no, you don't need to be more or better to get it right. Their impulsive reactions, their fragility, their reactivity, their lack of self-reflective capacity, that's on them. And if they choose not to do the work on themselves, it definitely will never change. And even if they do, it may not. The explanation then needs to become one more tool you can use to protect yourself, to fortify your own sanity, to not personalize it, to disengage a bit, and yes, in some cases, to leave. It can fortify your radical acceptance to know that this is not going to change, and this is it, whether you stay or go. But the explanations should not be a bridge to making excuses. Their backstory is not your problem. You didn't abuse them, and you aren't their therapist, so you can't be the one to set them straight. Standing around and being abused in the name of another person's narcissism is not noble, and it's not martyr-like. It's dangerous, it's unhealthy, and it enables them further to keep treating other people badly. Explanations can also drive predictions about behavior. If we can understand narcissism and why it is what it is, we can understand anything, we might be able to predict it. For example, you know that a narcissist lacks empathy. We know why a narcissist lacks empathy. So you also know that if you share a heartfelt, emotional story with them, they may end up looking bored or disinterested. If you at this point don't get that, then that's on you. Because the explanations will tell you that. We know that that's how they're going to respond to that. And then if you excuse it when it happens, then you are not only ignoring that explanation, maybe you're just taking that explanation and turning it into an excuse. So even as you watch this YouTube channel, I do recognize that every case is a little different. And while these sweeping patterns I talk about are generally correct, yeah, there are some individual differences. While I give you these explanations, they're meant to be educational. They are not ever meant to serve as a tool to make an excuse for another person's behavior. And when you hear explanations, hear them with a very clear ear. Don't accept them as excuses, because if you do, you will just enter the whole cycle again. And how much of your life do you want to waste that way? If you're going to take the time to put the effort to learn these explanations for the why of it, then take that information, please, and let it be something that drives radical acceptance for you. Please don't let it be a place where you make excuses and say, they have a fragile ego, so maybe I should give them a chance. No. If somebody is treating you in a toxic, invalidating, and an abusive manner, maybe understanding it can help you say, okay, now I get it, but please commit to not excusing it. I hope this answers this question for you and gives you pause to think about, maybe I am using explanations as excuses, and that's how I keep getting stuck in this toxic cycle. Or that might be what blocks you from true radical acceptance.
I today am going to give you a simple way to remember how to deal with any kind of narcissist in any part of your life. Very simply, I'm going to tell you to go deep. Now, DEEP is an acronym, and it's a nice and intuitive acronym. Since narcissistic people are so superficial, it would seem that the antidote would be to go deep. Now, those of you who have been to my seminars and read what I've written and all of that, you've heard me talk about the concept of going deep ad nauseum. But if you have not, I wanted to make sure that everyone has this topic and this technique at easy reach. So let's break down what DEEP stands for, and then really break it down. The D stands for defend, the E stands for engage, the next E stands for explain, and that P stands for personalize. So simply put, if you have to deal with someone who is narcissistic, do not defend, engage, explain, or personalize. So let's go deep in understanding what this really means. First, don't defend, D. It's the most common mistake that people make in the face of narcissistic people. Now listen, when someone is accusing us of something we did not do, or is projecting their dysfunction on us, we want to defend ourselves. This is particularly pronounced when we are being gaslighted. It can be a sort of eternal circle of hell when a narcissistic person is gaslighting you about something, anything, and you defend yourself, and they double down, and you keep defending, and on and on. And you may be wondering, but listen, somebody is accusing me of something I didn't do. I want to defend myself. Defend away. But remember the cardinal rule of any narcissistic relationship. They aren't listening to you, and they don't really care what you have to say. So you're putting a lot of effort in and giving them lots of narcissistic supply when you keep defending yourself. Especially if you start escalating and your volume goes up, and then the narcissistic person takes a certain amount of glee in being the one who keeps it together while you keep defending and defending. It's a waste of time and energy. You know what you did or didn't do. You know your intentions. They aren't listening to you, so don't defend or do any of that with them. A relationship with a narcissistic person is like living in an eternal kangaroo court. You are forever defending yourself against false charges with no due process. Second, don't explain, E. This is a riff on not defending. But since a relationship with a narcissistic person seems to be an eternal misunderstanding, mostly because their insecurity is being chronically triggered, because they're not capable of self-reflective capacity, the fact is they'll take everything you say and put a really malevolent, mean-spirited twist on it. Basically, as a rule, narcissistic people think everyone is either out to get them or is envious of them. Now, a major challenge with narcissism is they hold firm to only their narrative and cannot make room for the possibility that other people have their own experiences and interpretations of events. Again, just like with when you defend, when you explain, you are talking to someone who is not listening, and you keep going down the same rabbit hole again and again. So many times a person wants the narcissistic person to just understand them. And if they could just understand them, it would be fine. Listen, they aren't listening to you, so don't explain. It's a waste of your psychological energy and really contributes to a sense of feeling as though you are losing any sense of control or even sanity in the world, because to explain, really put the time into explaining and really attempt to make your point and then have it ignored is extremely invalidating. Next, E, don't engage. Now this is actually just gray rocking, right? Not much comes out of really engaging with a narcissistic person. And by engaging, I mean sharing your opinions, being authentic, taking on difficult conversations, being vulnerable, talking about sensitive matters, offering feedback or a meaningful, mild critique. Don't do it. More often than not, if you engage, you'll end up in gaslighting or invalidation or just general discomfort. I actually hate gray rocking because it saps people of their authenticity. And at best, it is an impoverished form of human contact. And yet, gray rocking is an essential survival tool if you have to maintain a relationship with a narcissist. This may be anything from co-parenting to a divorce that feels too difficult to take on, to a parent or person from your family of origin, to a boss in a workplace you cannot yet leave. In the long term, Remaining in any kind of narcissistic relationship is not good for your health. Gray rocking is like driving on a spare tire. It's not meant for a long-term drive. If you find yourself having to gray rock in the long term, make sure you develop other sources of social support. This may be friends, support groups, therapy, because the emptiness and hollowness of a gray rocked world or primary relationships means that you need some places where you can have full and rich social interactions. Next is don't personalize. P for personalize. Now this is tough guidance because these relationships feel personal, and it is personal because you're hurt and you're having real emotional reactions. However, what I mean is don't personalize their behavior. You're not engaging in their behavior. You're not responsible for it. You aren't the one gaslighting. They are. You aren't the one minimizing. They are. You aren't the one behaving badly. They are. They may try to pitch it that their behavior is your fault, but as adults, we are responsible for our own behavior, tempting as it may be to foist our behavior onto other people. So when the narcissistic person is communicating in a way that feels dehumanizing, it is not because you are not enough, it's because they are treating you badly. Self-blame is such a universal part of narcissistic abuse. To not personalize means to steer clear of that self-blame. Emotional abuse is not okay. Never. So to review one more time, don't D, defend, don't E, explain, don't E, engage, and don't P, personalize, deep. Keep that with you. When you find yourself getting sucked back into their vortex, remember it deep. And this is not just about verbal communication. It is about texting, email, any form of communication. Don't get into the ultra-long text messages or the multi-page emails where you defend, explain, etc. Don't personalize their hostile texts. Antagonistic communication is what they do, and a narcissist loves them a good text battle. Healthy people shouldn't like these. They're not good for you. But narcissistic people love the ability to use their electronic device as a weapon to attack someone with. Some of you are watching this and thinking that if I don't defend or explain, aren't I just being a doormat and letting them walk all over me? Listen, they already are walking all over you. This technique is just meant to decrease the duration of the walkover. Remember that so much of these narcissistic relationships are about baiting. They want you to defend and explain. They like when other people get worked up and agitated so they can calmly sit there and behave as though they are superior and sort of not being dramatic while you're explaining and defending more and more. If you can think of the deep technique as a way of not giving them narcissistic supply, then it feels less like you being a doormat and more like you not engaging with someone who treats you with disrespect. It can help to have other spaces in which to talk about the relational dynamics, so at least you can have a healthy sounding board. It just will not happen with a narcissistic person. So go deep so you can avoid the superficial shenanigans of a narcissistic relationship and keep yourself and your psychological bandwidth for far more important activities, endeavors, and people. So, I talk a lot about discernment, and discernment is a key skill to learn in managing these relationships. But the other thing, the balancing act here, is that people say, oh, this makes me so uncomfortable, this narcissism thing. And it seems like the only way to manage this is to get out of these relationships. And I'm here to tell you there are ways to think about this without having to break up with your friends and family. So let's take this on. I know that people don't like the idea of thinking about having to walk away from people they care about, and I get that. So let me just start it this way. You have a friend. You like this person, well enough. You've known them for a long time. There's been a few annoying things, maybe some pink flags, but they usually aren't deal breakers. Over the years, you've been very open and flexible with this friend. You've shared personal issues in your life, deep personal issues and vulnerabilities in your life with them. They aren't always the greatest listener, but you've trusted them with what you've told them. You've changed your schedule around to accommodate them. Your friend asks you if you want to go to a big ticket concert, hard to get tickets coming into town. She's driving. She asks you, can you charge the tickets? She'll pay you back. They're impossible to get. So you do. You get the tickets, but she cancels 2 hours before. You can't find someone else. And then she argues about paying for the tickets. Let's say the tickets came to $2,000, some enormous amount of money. So you may be thinking this video has some am I the asshole vibes, but it doesn't. Just put it out there. What would you do? Would you dump this person as a friend, even if you've known them for many years? If she pays you back, would you go back to normal like nothing happened? And what if this wasn't the first time she'd done something like this? This kind of expensive flakiness or real insensitivity, and she acts like she's done nothing wrong. When we have had long histories and linked lives with people close to us, family, close friends, partners, even long-standing colleagues, we have to think about how we can use these relationships as a place to practice discernment. I've had a lot of people talk about this with me and clients and whatnot. And because discernment is so important, I thought to sort of cobble all of this together as a technique that many of you could think about. Like, listen, I'm a former professor. So for the last 25 years, I've been thinking of everything as grades, A, B, C, D, and so on. A is good, F is bad, that kind of thing. I have found it useful when talking with clients and thinking of ways to calibrate around, especially the narcissistic relationship in your life, to think about it as sort of a leveling/grading system, right? The people in your life who are A's, they have a full access pass. These are the people you'd pick up at the airport during rush hour. You trust them. You're open with them. You know if you gave them money, they'd definitely give it back. You could be your full authentic self with these people. The luckiest people among us have family members who are level A. Really lucky people have a spouse who's a level A. A's are rare and wonderful, and I think mental health very much. If we have A's, we're going to be in pretty good shape. But what if an A hurts you, and hurts you more than once? Can you demote them to a B? I think so. B's are still close. Maybe not late night rush hour airport close. Maybe you don't tell them all the things that are happening in your life, and you're aware that you need to be a little bit more careful. You can't be uncensored like you are with the A's. A person may come into your life as a B. Maybe you just know them at work or you don't agree with some of their beliefs. Well, what if a B messes up? They become, a C. Now, the C's are the people what we might call like, I'm having a big barbecue and they aren't terrible to have around and they're kind of fun. You may not ever knock yourself out to do a one-on-one with them. You may say happy birthday on social media, but the intimacy piece here is dropped. There may be some red flags you see that make you uncomfortable. You're not so close. You're definitely not sharing secrets. You're more guarded. You're not your full self with them. You don't feel safe being your full self with them. You may expend a fair amount of bandwidth to be careful with them. They've gaslighted you in the past, and you sure as hell aren't turning your life around for these folks. Now you might be thinking, ooh, what if a C does me wrong? Can this elevator go lower? Yes, it can to the D's. Now, a D is not a passing grade. So these are people who are not good for you. They may be around in your life because you work with them. They're a friend of a friend. They're an extended family member. You may not have any kind of independent relationship with them, but you have had experiences with them where you've learned you cannot trust them. They may have done pretty significantly wrong to you in the past. Yes, the elevator has one more stop, and yes, some people do get F's. F's are the folks who have really harmed you more than once, chronically and badly. Or they've harmed people who are close to you. They may be harmful to you. Now, the point of this exercise is not to open up your address book on your phone and give everyone a grade. What it is a way to think about how to maintain internal boundaries towards people in our lives and to practice that fine art of discernment. You have that A, and we love our A's, right? That A, though, starts being a little bit gaslighty, irresponsible. They lie. They hurt you more than a few times. You may roll them down to a B or even a C. It means you're more careful with them. You don't trust them to follow through. It's like touching a hot stove. Ideally, you don't do it more than once. This isn't just meant to be a mental experiment. It's a way of giving yourself permission to say, I'm not feeling this anymore. This doesn't feel safe anymore. I'm not going to cut people off. That doesn't feel good either. But I'm going to give this person a little less access to me, to all of me, to protect myself from invalidation or stress or disrespect. It doesn't need to be all or nothing. The lady with those concert tickets who spent $2,000 and ended up, holding the bag on one of them, may not have wanted to say goodbye for good with this friend, but she had started to burn out on the up and down with this person, and she may learn to say, next time this person asks, I think I'll pass on the tickets. Maybe we could just do something like get a cup of coffee next time. Discernment is a very subtle process. It's the willingness to pay attention to new data, integrating it and giving ourselves permission to respect ourselves and be careful about how we show up and protect our vulnerabilities. Discernment is everything when it comes to managing narcissistic relationships. Having some kind of system that allows you to understand how you can show up with them. Yeah, you can use colors if you want, numbers. I use letter grades. It's what works for me. It allows you to stay in touch and give you a framework for a very nuanced process to set boundaries that work and still be able to maintain people in your life that you feel close to. We often don't mindfully approach our relationships, which is what often gets us into hot water, especially with relationships that have been around for a long time. It's painful to demote an A from a C, but it's crucial that we slow down, pay attention. You can almost view it as like a little slider, a slider that goes back and forth and settle on a place with a person that feels safe and informed. Not everyone in our lives is created equal, and while the most toxic folks in your life will not appreciate your discernment, discernment becomes a way to maintain your social networks in a far more thoughtful manner. One thing narcissistic abuse does to us, it takes away our discernment. We are almost taught to believe relationships are all or nothing. You're either all in and getting absolutely abused, or you've got to completely cut off, but that also feels unsettling because you may lose other people. But when you can start to see not so much, I'm going to bring this one down. Again, that's why I use this idea of a slider, a very, very gradual kind of, or a little like a volume button. I'm turning this one down a little bit. This doesn't feel good. That kind of safety, that kind of sort of way to think about setting boundaries internally for yourself doesn't mean you're cutting bait, but it does mean that you are being mindful and aware and honoring what allows you to feel more comfortable and safe, armed with realistic expectations in all of your relationships, healthy and not. So lots of people are talking about low contact online. What I want to do in this video is, because so many people are talking about it here on a channel about narcissism, I want to talk about the pros and cons. It's not a bad strategy at all, but it's not an answer, a complete 100% foolproof answer in every narcissistically abusive situation. So first, let's get our terms straight. Let's start with talking about no contact. No contact is just what it sounds like. It's scorched earth. You don't take the calls, you block them, you don't show up. It's like you are dead to the person and they are dead to you. Done. Now, no contact to me, though, is a pretty rarefied strategy. Not everyone has access to being able to do no contact. It wouldn't work, for example, if you're co-parenting minor children. It doesn't really work in all workplaces. It doesn't always work in family systems. If you want access to some family members and want to go no contact with others, or have children who are invested in cousins or grandparents. Now, when you're able to do no contact, frankly, it works like a charm. You cut out the exposure to the toxic person or situation, and obviously the vast majority of people feel better. Some people go no contact and really hold to it, but then life happens, an illness, a death, and then they're pulled back in. And they will liken being pulled back into drinking poison, getting pulled back into a system that they bravely went no contact from. And as soon as they're back into it, they literally feel sick right away. Now, there are also techniques like gray rocking. That's that dull, emotionless, inert sort of responding to a narcissistic person in hopes that maybe they'll get bored because you aren't taking the bait. You're not even showing them any emotion. They get bored and move on. Then there's firewalling, a technique where you are very careful to not let any sensitive information out. You kind of just stick to talking about the weather. You also learn to not personalize what they do and say, so you don't take in their nonsense and make it your own. It means keeping your distance and really disengaging and interacting as little as possible. But when you interact, you don't have to be as flat as gray rock. You can sort of have normal emotional range. You just can't share anything about yourself. It's kind of saying, hey, looks like it's going to rain tomorrow. Then there's yellow rocking, where you still keep it tight. You don't take the bait, but you do allow yourself emotional range. This is often recommended to co-parents in these kinds of situations. And then that way your children aren't thrown off by sort of the flatness of gray rocking, which can be sort of unsettling for a child who's trying to negotiate this territory. But all of this gray rocking, firewalling, and yellow rocking, all of it fall under the rubric of low contact. Low contact is realistic. It may mean, for example, you show up for one family dinner a year or only see the ex at the children's soccer games. But low contact also means that you really do practice the deep technique. You don't engage, nor do you defend or explain or personalize. Like I said, you stick to the weather, neutral topics like, oh, look, they opened a new coffee shop in town. There is just no there when you talk under low contact situations. Low contact means that you get out before the emotions start to flare. And when you sense the baiting starting and coming out, you gracefully find the exits. Low contact is not as easy peasy as it sounds. There are often enabler pressures floating around you. Oh, come on now. Your brother isn't that bad. And your mom made lasagna. Come on over for dinner. Or your cousin's visiting from another country. You have to come. Or family members pressuring you to do more things with the ex so the children have a sense of family. Or a group of friends saying, oh, come on now. She isn't that bad. Come on our wine tasting weekend. It'll be okay. Or a group of colleagues sort of cajoling you to go to the workplace happy hour. Low contact means holding your ground even when those pressures show up. It means not taking the bait during your encounters. It means not getting lulled into a hoovery space. Low contact is often an interesting form of diplomacy that allows family systems to keep running at some level, workplaces to keep working, children maybe feeling a little bit more comfortable in sort of divorce situations, friend groups may be functional. It's not meant to be enabling, nor is it meant to be denial. You are aware of what you're doing and protective of yourself, but not fully cutting away because you feel like you can't do that. Now you have to pace your low contact. It doesn't mean the same amount of contact for everyone. One person's low contact is one person's high contact. For some people, it might mean contact once a week. For others, it may mean once a year. It really depends on the nature of the relationship and the context of that relationship. But low contact is an intentional process. It means you do it in settings and contexts that are comfortable to you, where escape is readily available at times when you feel you have the bandwidth to manage it, or when you feel supported. For example, I've seen several parents of adult children where there is one parent who is a narcissist having to do this at weddings or christenings, things for their adult children. At that point, their children are adults. And you're no longer juggling all the and all this other stuff and all those other logistics. So there's really no more reason for any contact with that narcissistic ex. But then a wedding or that kind of intense social event brings you together with your ex. And low contact might mean, for example, at that wedding, having lots of support around you as a co-parent in this situation, and having the people around you who know that they can run and should run interference, so you can minimize your contact with the other parent and allow your child to have a wonderful wedding day, and for you to be fully present without having to dodge getting cornered or gaslighted by the narcissistic ex. That's an example of how that intentionality of low contact works. Low contact is a form of something that I've long called soul distancing. Your mind and body can be in the interaction, but you keep your soul out of it. You can have the superficial conversations about the wedding and maintain a boundary. You can get out when you start feeling, when you can get out of the interaction, step away. When you start feeling more and more uncomfortable, you can be like, oh, sorry, got to go to the bathroom. So low contact is an umbrella term that takes in a lot of territory, but it's a realistic approach to the many narcissistic relationships that we have in our lives, and that we don't have the luxury of fully cutting and running from. So anyone who's listened this far, I'd love to hear from you. Have any of you tried low contact? Has it worked? What has worked and what hasn't worked? Because some people have said, like, I've done low contact, but some things worked better than others. People might find themselves getting sucked into texting too much or any of those things. So let us know what your low contact strategies are and what has worked. And like I said, in some ways, it's all relative. One person's low contact is one person's way too much. So be aware that there's something relative about it. But for you, it's definitely going to mark a departure from regular contact. And if it's somebody, for example, you have to, I don't know, see some with some regularity, for example, at work, it's a great example, is you don't go to the happy hour, you really keep to yourself. So give it a shot, but I think it is a very useful technique in narcissistic relationships. Thanks again.